Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Just a couple quick notes. First of all, tonight's learning is in honor of all the Jewish people in the land of Israel who are on the front lines, those who are in need of refuah shlema, those who are in captivity, and our learning tonight should be a merit for them, and we should see a complete turnaround of the situation and only good. If you would like to sponsor a class, sponsorships are available as usual. We also put a link in the comments. Our annual year-end fundraiser is still going on until the end of the year. You get a tax-deductible donation, power.chabadaluf.org. If you would like to participate, that should be in the description as well. Okay, let's jump into it. This week's Torah portion is the Torah portion of Vayechi, the last Torah portion in the book of Genesis. Checking our connection over here. It says we have a bad connection. If there's any issues, please put in the comments. If there's any connectivity issues, hold on. I'm getting a phone call. We'll call them back. Okay, so in this week's Torah portion, Vayechi, of course, it means that he lived. So what do you think happened? Of course, Jacob passes away, right? Jacob says, and Jacob lived. So we know that this is the week that Jacob passes away, right? In the week of Chaya Sarah, the life of Sarah, Sarah passes away. Just goes to show you about the life of a righteous person. It's not determined by their passing necessarily, but that is a side point. So in this week's Torah portion, Jacob calls all his children, and he wants to know if they are righteous because his father Isaac had a son named Esau. His grandfather Abraham had a son named Ishmael. And so he thinks maybe out of his 12 children, maybe one of them are not righteous. And he says, Jacob says in Genesis 49, verse 1, chapter 49, verse 1, Jacob called for his sons and said, gather, and I will tell you what will happen at the end of the days. Gather and listen, sons of Jacob. Listen to Israel, your father. So he says maybe some of them are not righteous. How do you know what's in someone's mind, what's in someone's heart? So they answer him, Shema Yisrael, Hear O Israel, referring to their father Israel. Hear O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. So Yaakov hears that, and he responds, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuso Le'olam Va'ed, and he responds, blessed be the name of the glory of his kingdom forever and ever. And we see the original Shema was a response between Jacob and his children. So he says obviously their hearts are with God. They are saying that their hearts are with God. Okay. So we see here this idea as well is brought in the book of Hosea. It says, Ka'anovim ba'midbar matzasi Yisrael. Like grapes in the desert, I found Israel. So this idea, our sages tell us in the Medrash, that this refers also to the children of Israel, to the tribes, that they are all righteous. What does it mean there? Why does this prove that the tribes were all righteous? So it says, don't read it Israel as Yisrael. Rather read it Ra'akel, that God saw that all their deeds were perfect. Right? That instead of reading it as Yisrael, read it as Ra'akel, that God saw that their deeds were perfect, and that is the interpretation of that verse in Hosea. Again, referring to our conversation this week's Torah portion about Israel and his children, Jacob and his children. So tonight we're going to kind of go off on a tangent a little bit. We'll come back to this idea. We're going to go off on a tangent a little bit about this idea of studying the Torah in a way with this idea of reading the words incorrectly to get a homiletical interpretation. This is one of the Torah's exegetical principles, the exegesis of Torah. If you don't know what exegesis means, that's okay. I don't either. But it basically means how do you expound things for the Torah. So let's get into this idea, how this works. So the Torah was given to Moses on Mount Sinai, and I'm reading now from Maimonides' Introduction to Mishnah Torah. In Maimonides, before he writes his code of Jewish law and how one should conduct oneself, he explains how he got to his conclusions. He's like, I didn't make it up. This is all given down from Moses. So he says Moses given the mitzvahs on Sinai and their explanations. like it says in the verse, and I will give you the tablets of stone, the Torah, and the mitzvah. The Torah refers to the written law. The mitzvah refers to the oral law. Its explanation. God commanded us to fill the Torah according to the instructions of the mitzvah. The mitzvah is called the oral law. Okay? Now, Moses personally transcribes the Torah before he passes away, and he gives the Torah scroll to each tribe and placed another scroll in the Ark of Covenant. As the verse says, take this Torah scroll and place it beside the Ark, and I will be there as a testimonial. The mitzvah, i.e. the explanation of the Torah, he did not transcribe. Instead, he commanded it verbally to the elders, to Joshua, and to the totality of Israel. As the verse states, be careful to observe everything I prescribe to you. For this reason, it is called the oral law. So again, we have two parts of the Torah. There's the written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and then there's the explanations. How do we know what every word in the Torah means? And all the explanations, all the expositions are passed down, are not written down specifically. Now, this was true for about 1,000 years. For 1,000 years, it was passed down from teacher to student, until Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was, besides being a political leader of Israel, he was also the spiritual leader of the Jewish people. And he realized that the Torah was in crisis because of the Jewish persecution. The Torah was going to be forgotten. So he realized that it was important to codify and to write down and to really canonize all the debates and all the interpretations that had been expounded on for the past almost 1,000 years. Practically, they were only the past few hundred years because that's what he had access to of those conversations. And he puts them down in a code called the Mishnah. And this is the first time that the oral Torah was written down in a proper manner. And then the Talmud continues to expound on these ideas, meaning the Rabbi Yehuda Nasi in the Mishnah just kind of got to the law. So it says, Rabbi this says this, Rabbi that says that. So why did Rabbi so-and-so come to his conclusion? Why does Rabbi so-and-so come to his conclusion? Where do they see that in the Torah? So this is all expounded on in the Talmud, basically recreating those detailed conversations that were codified into short laws. The rabbis of the Talmud expounded on. Okay. Now, one of the things that they do is they use these exegetical principles to expound on what is in the written Torah. Now, what's clear is that all the things that the rabbis in the Talmud said, whether it's like we're about to see this idea of don't read it as this, read it as that, or whether it's putting two ideas or two words that are close together, therefore that you could learn principles from one law to another law because of their closeness in the Torah, or what is called a kal v'chomer, when you have something that is more obvious than something that is less obvious, you can learn one from the other. All these principles are passed down from Moses, and you can't just make them up. It's not that the rabbis came and like, well, this is a great idea. This law is next to this law. They have these ideas. The rules were passed down from teacher to student, and they were said, okay, this rule applies to this verse, this rule applies to that verse. This is all passed down from Moses. Okay. So this idea of this, we'll call it the don't read it rule. In the Hebrew, it's called the al tikri, don't read it, are one of the principles of the oral Torah. Now, like we said, everything is included in the oral Torah, and we're going to give some examples of how this principle of don't read it works. We'll give 3 examples. So the first example that we'll give is as follows. Abraham was bringing godliness into the world. So the Torah tells us, Abraham in Genesis 21, verse 33, Abraham called there in the name of the Lord, the God of the world. Okay? Now it says, Vayikra Sham, and he called there. That is the word that means that he called there. So the rabbis in the Talmud say as follows. Reish Lakish was a rabbi in the Talmud. He says, don't read it called, but rather he caused them to call. Meaning not that he himself called out to God, but he made others call out to God. Meaning, Abraham caused God's name to be on the lips of all passerby. How did he accomplish this? After he wined and dined them, they rose to bless him. He asked them, did you eat my food? You ate from the food of the God of the universe. Praise him and bless him, he who uttered and the world came into being. So by feeding people, passerby, they would thank Abraham. Abraham said, why are you thanking me? You have to thank God. This is the food. This is God's food. So we see here that we say, don't read it as he called, rather read it as he caused them to call. Okay? In the case in the Hebrew, vayikra and vayakri. Okay? So that's one example of this principle being used. A second example, it says in Exodus 12:17, Ushmartem es hamatzos, you shall guard the matzos. There's a mitzvah in the Torah to be careful that the matzos should not become chametz. So Rabbi Yoshia in the Rabbi Yoshia, this is brought in Yalkut Shimoni, it's also brought in the Gemara in Kiddushin, says, don't read it, guard the matzvos, rather guard the mitzvahs. Okay, so he says the same letters, but at different vowels. So instead of matzvahs, it's mitzvahs. That why, that when a mitzvah opportunity comes to you, you should not let it rise. Just the same way you're not supposed to let the matzah rise, you have to guard it. Be careful not to let a mitzvah become stale or leavened in this case. So we see here another idea of this. Don't read it one way, read it another way. Another one is in Isaiah. It says, fortunate is the man who will do this and the person who will hold fast to it, he who keeps the Shabbos from profaning it and guards his hand from doing any evil. This is a verse in Isaiah, and the Talmud says about this verse, Rabbi Chia bar Abba said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, one who observes the Shabbos properly, even if they worship idols, is forgiven of their sins. As the verse says, fortunate is the man who will do this from profaning it. Don't read it profaning it, mechalalo, but read it, he is forgiven, macholoi. So we see the machalaloi is one word, and you split it into two, it becomes macholoi, he becomes forgiven. Even if he worshipped idols, one who observes the Shabbos is forgiven. So again, we see this homiletical interpretation. Now, when it comes to this homiletical interpretation and this idea, it doesn't mean that we're misinterpreting the words. We're not saying that this is the true meaning. We're saying in addition to the true meaning, we're adding on to the right. So using the example of the matzahs versus the mitzvahs, not saying that you don't have to guard the matzahs, you only have to guard mitzvahs. We're saying it's both. It's both guarding the matzahs and the mitzvahs. Again, the same thing with Abraham. Abraham called out to God, but he also made people call. That is this how this word, this principle is used. Now, this principle actually is so important. This al-tikri, this don't read it principle, is so key and so fundamental. Actually, in the first words, the first word and the last word of the Torah, are both of these are used. So let's go into it. The first word of the Torah is Bereshis, and that God created in the beginning. So literally means Bereshit, he created in the beginning. That is what the word Bereshis means. So in the Talmud and the Gemara Sukkah says, Rabbi Bar Chana says, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the Shittim were created during the 6 days of creation. What is the Shittim? We'll see in a second. The school of Rabbi Shmuel taught, don't read it Bereshis, but read it Barashis. God created the cavities. What are these cavities? The cavities were underneath the Temple Mount, really underneath the altar, were these cavities that would flow out of the Temple Mount, and when they would pour the libations of the wine, and on Sukkot they would pour the libation of the water, it would go into these cavities and would flow out of the Beis HaMikdash. So now coming back to our original conversation, the last word of the Torah is Yisrael, is Israel, right? That Moses, it says that Le'enei Kol Yisrael, to the eyes of all of Israel. That is how the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, ends, referring to that Moses broke the tablets in front of all of Israel. That is how the last words of the Torah. So again, this interpretation that we mentioned earlier, that all the Jewish people were perfect, were all the tribes were worthy, that is the same interpretation given for those words. It says, like we said in earlier, right, that don't read it Yisrael, right, but Ra'akel, that God saw that their deeds were perfect. So we see here that this principle is not just another principle of Torah exegesis, but rather this is a fundamental principle of the Torah. So it must be that there is some sort of lesson that we must be able to learn from this idea of don't read it. So we're going to go into the Hasidic interpretation of this idea of why this is such a fundamental principle of Torah exegesis, of expounding and learning from the Torah. So let's look at the first words and the last words. The first words of the Torah are teaching us something about the beginning of one's service to God, and the last words of the Torah are referring to the conclusion, or the completion, really is the right word, of someone's service to God. In the beginning is that a person looks at this idea that in the beginning, the first words of the Torah is referring to that God created these cavities under the Temple Mount, under the altar. We know it says in the Talmud that the world was created from the Temple Mount. That was the first place of creation, and from that it was like a snowball, and from there the God created the world. It says in the Talmud. It says, Mitzion Nivra Olam. From Zion, the world was created. Sharei Shaninu Bebraisa. We learned in a Braisa, in a teaching, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Olam Memsiasa Nivra. The world was created from the center, as the verse states, when the dust runs into a mass and the clods cleave fast together. Okay, so kind of like Jerusalem was built first, Rashi says, and the clods of earth were all massed together around Jerusalem. So actually, this idea is that the foundation of the world is Jerusalem, is the Temple Mount itself. So when a person is starting out his service of God, and the first words he opens the Torah, and the first word is that the foundation of the entire world is built from spirituality, from his connection to God through his service of God. When a person understands that, he understands that it's not that there's I have God and I have the world, and I have to reconcile these two. But no, the foundation of a person's mission in this world, creation itself, is this idea of that the world was created from the Temple Mount. Now, and what is the last words of the Torah? That Ra'akel, that God sees. And the Hasidic interpretation of this is not just that Ra'akel, that God sees, but that we could actually see God. That through a person's divine service, we could see godliness in the world. So in the beginning, we understand we haven't started our service of God yet. So the only way we can understand it is through the Torah tells us, listen, the foundational principle of the world is godliness. That is the foundational principle. Now, through your service of God, you could actually get to see it. Ra'akel. You could actually get to see that not only will you believe it and understand that this is a foundational principle, but you will realize that is the truth. And if you take it even further, that really this idea of don't read it, this principle is not just in the actual interpretation of the first word and the last word of the Torah, but in fact, it is a foundational principle of life and divine service. In that, when we come to approach the world, many times the world seems one way, but we have to realize that the Torah is telling us, al tikri, don't see things, don't read it, don't see things at face value. Not everything is as it appears. That when it comes to, for example, a person, if a child you're going to teach a child, that he has to keep kosher. You tell him, listen, just because you're offered a candy or an ice cream cone, you have to first realize, don't take it at face value. Is it kosher? If it is kosher, you have to make a blessing on it before you eat it. And every single thing that we encounter in our lives, we have to realize it's not just at face value, but there's a spiritual component here. There's a spiritual foundation to what we see. And we have to sometimes take a step back and say, let's not take it at face value. There's something deeper here. There's a divine mission in every single thing that we encounter. And the same thing also applies not just in education, as we mentioned, or in our personal lives, but also in our emotional understandings of people, in our relationships. There's a famous story of a rabbi who was approached on the eve of Passover by a poor man in his community. And he asked his rabbi, is it okay to use milk for the 4 cups instead of wine, can I use 4 cups of milk? So the rabbi strokes his beard and he says, come back to me later. Come back to me in an hour. Let me think about it. It's a very serious question. As soon as the man left, he calls in his assistant and he says, please, can you go to the communal fund and purchase for this man matzah, wine, meat, fish, potatoes, all the things that a person would need for the Passover holiday. He says, Rabbi, why are you purchasing all these things for him? He said, listen, I know that he asked me if you're allowed to use milk for the 4 cups. Now, if he's using milk and he's a pious, observant Jew, he's obviously doesn't have meat, because if he had meat, he wouldn't even have the question. You can't eat meat and milk together. So he doesn't have meat, and we know he doesn't have wine. He definitely doesn't have meat. He probably doesn't have matzah either. So make sure that this person gets everything that they need for the holiday. So in this case, this rabbi, he didn't take this idea at face value. He didn't read it. He didn't answer the question, and instead he read into this person and he made a connection to this person and saw what this person really needs. So we have this idea also in a relational level that we have to sometimes we're given an opportunity to interact with somebody, and the question is, are you going to just take what they say for face value, or are you going to understand what's really going on here? So with that, we'll leave it here. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Again, tonight's learning was in honor and the merit of all those in the land of Israel who need a salvation. And if you would like to support the work of Chabad, please go to powered.chabad.org, make your tax-deductible donation before December 31st. Thank you very much. Have a great evening and a wonderful Shabbos. See you, God willing, next week.